on the NewsChannel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Hello everyone, welcome to OpenLine. An important show tonight. Tennessee is set to execute someone in just 24 hours. 24 hours from now, Stephen Michael West is set to be put to death. He has chosen the electric chair. He was convicted in the 1986 kidnapping and stabbing death of 51-year-old Wanda Romines and her 15-year-old daughter Sheila, and he was convicted of raping Sheila. So a terrible crime. He is set to be executed tomorrow. He's on death watch right now. So we want to talk about this issue. Tennessee is certainly beginning to execute more people. We've seen several executions now in just the last year. This is the second execution under our new governor, Bill Lee. So we're talking tonight with Reverend Stacy Rector with Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
You've been on before. We appreciate you coming back. We'll talk big picture about the death penalty, but what are your thoughts about this particular case? We're talking about Stephen Michael West. He's been on death row a long time. What are some of your concerns or thoughts about this case?
My primary concern with this case is Steve West's mental health condition. He was diagnosed in 2001 by doctors working for the Tennessee Department of Corrections actually, he's been diagnosed with various severe mental illnesses. I think the last diagnosis was schizoaffective disorder, which is a very severe mental illness, and has been diagnosed and treated by the Department of Corrections now for nearly 20 years on antipsychotic medications, heavily medicated. And this is, certainly problematic for me, and I think for a lot of Tennesseans, that we recognize, and it's really beyond disputing, that this man is very ill. So much so that he's been heavily medicated. However, that exact medication and treatment has allowed him now to be competent for execution. And so it just seems very much like an ethical catch-22. And I had hoped that Governor Lee would be able to see that as well and decide that this just simply is not something Tennessee could do to execute someone with this level of severe mental illness. Unfortunately, it appears that that is what Tennessee is planning to do.
Is that, so that argument's been brought up before about mental illness. I feel like several of the people that have been executed here recently in Tennessee, that has been the argument, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't stopped the execution. So do you think, I guess, hammer home why that argument is so important? Because if it's not making it with the two governors who have been set up, and others, I guess, why is that such an important argument?
Well, I mean, I think we, already in our country, we do not execute people with intellectual disabilities. We do not execute juveniles because we say that they, because of their disability or age, are less culpable in their understanding and their ability to rationalize and completely grasp what's going on, and therefore they should not be eligible for the ultimate punishment. Both of those groups of individuals can go to prison. They simply can't be executed. Unfortunately, our laws haven't caught up with severe mental illness. And so the fact remains that people with very severe mental illnesses that include psychosis, right, which is hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, I mean, very extreme symptoms. These individuals are still being sentenced to death and executed. Why this point about Steve West, I think, is and maybe a bit different than some of the other individuals, is the level of medication he has been receiving and the diagnosis that he has. There is no disputing that the state's own doctors are the ones who diagnosed him and have been treating him. And so you have this situation about whether or not someone is competent for execution. And if you're deemed to be incompetent, right, you don't understand that you're being executed, why you're being executed, you can't be, okay? So we treat him for humanitarian reasons, I mean, for 20 years, to control these horrible symptoms, but that allows for his competency, which then allows the very state that's acknowledged his illness and that has treated him to execute him. This seems very problematic to me.
And Tennessee's had several here recently. We are back executing people. How concerned are you about what you're seeing here recently in Tennessee?
Well, it's obviously very concerning as the nation seems to be moving away from the death penalty. Last year, Washington ended its death penalty. Just a couple months ago, New Hampshire ended its death penalty. We're now up to 21 states that no longer have the death penalty and 4 that have moratorium to say we're not going to execute. So that number of states that's moving away is increasing, while we in Tennessee, who historically have not used the death penalty very much, are seeing this kind of resurgence. But I think what's important to note, Ben, is death sentencing in our state is very low. That, to me, indicates more where we are in Tennessee as citizens and as the public. The fact that we're just not sentencing very many people to death. I think we've had 2 death sentences over the last 5 years in this state. What is happening now is we are executing people from another era of the criminal justice system, from the 80s, when we were not aware of so many of the things we're currently aware of, or if we were, it wasn't out in the public like it is today. It was much more contained. Lots of the problems with the system simply weren't being addressed or recognized, and so we have now sentenced people to death in the 80s that are only now being executed, who, were they sentenced today, might not even receive the death penalty.
You feel that? So some of these people, if they had been sentenced today, they wouldn't be getting the death penalty.
No, they would not.
But this case is so old, and every one of these cases is so old.
Yes.
So he received the death penalty in 1987.
That's correct.
And it appears that he may not have been the person. Now, this is a terrible crime.
Yes.
He may not have been the person to actually kill the 2. He may have been involved in the rape, as I understand it, but he didn't stab the 2 people. It was an accomplice who was a juvenile, is that right?
Yes.
And he received life. He didn't get the death penalty, and he may even get out.
Yes.
What do you think of that?
Well, again, it goes to this arbitrary nature of the death penalty. The death penalty is just, bottom line, not equally applied. And you have a situation like this where you have 2 people that are involved, things that were not revealed to the jury at the trial, such as the taped confession of the 17-year-old to the fact that he solely committed the murders, such as the long and horrific history of abuse since birth that Steve West endured. This was never presented to the jury. 2 jurors have since said we would have given a different sentence. This is another issue for me when you think about jurors, because any of us could be a juror, and the burden this places on a juror to go in and to have to decide whether a human being is going to live or die, and trust that you're getting all the information you need to make that decision, and then find out 20 years later, I didn't have all the information. There's all this stuff I didn't know. It just seems patently unfair to citizens to ask them to do that when we have alternatives like life without parole.
It do seems we see in several of these cases where old jurors, jurors from the trial, maybe they're probably old by this point.
They may be at this point.
Are saying, well, I didn't. So in this case, 2 of the 12 are saying, don't execute.
Right. I wouldn't have made that decision.
Now, you were with Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. So, what is that organization? And I guess let's talk about the alternatives. Let's go big picture here.
Okay.
But tell us about what is Tennesseans for Alternatives to the Death Penalty?
Well, we're an organization that's statewide that's primarily working to educate Tennesseans about all of the things we see as being wrong with the death penalty and why we think it's a failing and failed policy for Tennessee that's extremely costly and that's unnecessary for our state. And so we travel around, we talk to groups, we help people get the information they need to make those informed decisions for themselves about whether or not this is a policy that we think is working for us here in Tennessee. And so we've been at this for some time and have really seen progress as more and more people from a lot of different backgrounds, different perspectives are starting to say, wait a minute, this policy, is unfairly applied, it's expensive, it puts victims' family members through decades of litigation, it brings innocent people into the mix, sometimes sending them to death row. When we have alternatives, like life without parole, or a life sentence in Tennessee is another alternative. And that sentence in our state is a 51-year minimum before you're eligible for parole. It's one of the harshest life sentences in the country. So we have these two sentences that absolutely will protect the public and hold violent offenders accountable, that don't risk executing innocent people, that aren't as expensive, and that could give some legal finality much sooner to these families who end up waiting 30 years for a sentence to be carried out.
So you've been making this argument. Where do you see Tennessee right now? Certainly we're a state that we're back to executing people, but you said you're seeing some movement on both sides, Republican and
yes,
Democrat,
absolutely.
in the legislature.
Absolutely.
Are you seeing, what are you seeing in the state of Tennessee? Where do you think we'll be in 5 years, 10 years?
Well, I hope as there is a growing consensus, bipartisan, consensus that the system has problems. Regardless of what you think the solution to those problems are, most of us can say we've got some problems with the death penalty system and the criminal justice system as a whole. And what I hear conservatives saying on this issue is, look, we're about fiscal responsibility, we're about limited government, we're about pro-life policies, and we don't see how the death penalty fits into this, the death penalty system as we have it now. And the question I would pose is, because some folks say, well, we just need to fix it. Well, how do you fix a system that is this broken? How do you fix a system that already is far more expensive than the alternative sentences and is going to require a lot more money, right, to make improvements? And ultimately, a human system is fallible. A human system is fallible. We will never get it right 100% of the time. And for me, that issue alone, again, when you have alternatives like life without parole, that issue alone is enough to say we cannot be executing people within this system.
And yet, at the same time, what do you say to that family member who's had some horrible crime like this that involved terrible things, rape, stabbing, and they want the person put to death, and they think the person should be put to death. That's the ultimate punishment. What do you say to people that still think this is the right way to go? This is a horrible crime, and they should pay the ultimate price.
Well, I certainly can never speak for a murder victim's family member who's been through what this family has been through and many other families have been through. I am very honored to know some families who have been through horrific crimes where their loved ones were murdered and who have said to me, this system is just too hard. Some of them did not want the death penalty at the very beginning. Some of them did and changed their mind along the way because of the trauma that they continue to endure. What I would hope is that if we decided, instead of focusing 30 years of money, attention, energy toward pursuing the death penalty for someone, we focus that money, attention, and energy on those family members in providing them what they needed emotionally, spiritually, financially to begin to heal. My hope would be that perhaps the zeal for the death penalty might wane some because they're being heard and their needs are being addressed. And I think for so many families, they don't feel heard in the current system.
All right, well, that kind of sets the table. Now we'll take a break, and we want to hear from you. We have several people on the line, so hold on if you're on the line. And if you want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.